5-2 for two teams with very similar records, very different mindsets and psyche at this point in the 2014 campaign. Mark Rogers TV and I Talk SEC breaking down the Tigers and the Wildcats in Death Valley on Saturday. And consider this, LSU, we expected them to be a bit down, maybe take a step back from the championship race in the SEC, but still a top 15 team preseason. They have not proven to be that good. While Kentucky, we expected to be much improved, coming off 2-10 last season, 0-8 in the conference. Mark Stoops putting together a couple top 20 recruiting classes. So the Wildcats we expected to be better, but still too thin on the roster, too inexperienced in regards to the talent on that roster to make a move in the SEC. Not necessarily the case. The Wildcats have taken Florida to triple overtime on a controversial call, lost that game, might be 6-0 right now. Can you imagine the college football playoff scenario and discussion involving Kentucky halfway through the season? Still the Cats at 5-1. And again, LSU, despite 5-2, being a good start for a lot of teams across the country. Les Miles feeling the heat because LSU has not been impressive, and they've been outright atrocious at times, especially on the plains against Auburn, 41-7, and that Mississippi State loss that got the Dogs running toward the SEC Western Division Championship run. And let's talk about this one now. Kentucky at LSU. The Cats are 5-1 against the spread overall, 5-16 against the spread, though, in its last 21 road games. But that was a much different Kentucky team at that point. 5-14 against the spread in the Wildcats' last 19 non-conference conference games. LSU 2-5 against the spread this year is indicative of what the expectations have been again for LSU this season versus the performance again at 5-2. Kentucky again 5-1 this season. That's just the 8th time in the history of the program that Kentucky has been able to get off to a 5-1 start after 6 games. The first time since 2007. Wildcats coming off that 14-3 comeback win over Louisiana Monroe. They have a 2-1 conference record. So we're halfway through the season, and Kentucky's got a shot in a topsy-turvy SEC Eastern Division. They've already knocked off South Carolina, and as expected, Vandy with a 1 loss against Florida. And again, can you imagine if Kentucky was 3-0 right now in the SEC Eastern Division with a win over South Carolina and Florida under its belt? But that's not the case. LSU dodged a bullet last week against Florida. They got away with a 30-27 win at the Swamp. They avoided their first 0-3 start in the SEC since 1999. The Tigers are still pretty stout on defense when they put their mind to it. Ripped up against Mississippi State for an all-time program worst yardage figure against. They've rebounded well, held the Gators to 306 yards of total offense last week. Anthony Jennings still with a less than productive showing at the Swamp, 10 of 21, 110 yards and 1 touchdown. Leonard Fournette, number 1 recruited running back coming out of high school. He has taken the reins at LSU, and that was his breakout game, possibly with 140 yards and 2 touchdowns at Florida. Again, as LSU came back in the fourth quarter to win this game. A few other side notes on this one as we look at offensive and defensive unit matchups. The LSU offense is coming off a turnover-free night at Florida. Kentucky boasts an impressive pass defense that's ranked 3rd in the conference at just 192 yards a game. So LSU can't throw it, and Kentucky doesn't give up pass yardage. On the other hand, LSU, with that big, strong offensive line, a lot of those big maulers up front are headed to the NFL, as usual. Lyle Collins, the number 1 candidate, that Kentucky defensive front against the rush, not good. The rush defense is averaging 152 yards per game, and so expect LSU to keep it on the ground. Play action all night, off the ground game, run first, pass second. Senior linebacker for Kentucky. We talked about him during the offseason being under the radar nationally. But Bud Dupree is the active SEC sack leader right now with 19. Will try to take advantage of an LSU offensive line that's extremely talented, as mentioned, but performing in the run game, not necessarily the pass game, having given up 15 sacks. That's the second worst figure in the SEC. much of that discredit can also go to the quarterbacks, Anthony Jennings most notably, and also in part-time duty, Brandon Harris. Again, the LSU defense, after giving up that 568 spot in yardage against Mississippi State, has fared much better. They had a huge goal line stand that was key in holding off the Gators in the fourth quarter. And the Wildcat offense under Patrick Towles has exploded in recent weeks. 36 points, nearly 450 yards per game. Much of that against, of course, non-conference lesser foes. They spread the ball all over the place in the running game to JoJo Kemp, Braylon Hurd, and Stanley Williams. All those guys have 200-plus yards on the season. And just consider this. We talked about the recruiting classes at Kentucky being top-notch. These are a ton of freshmen and sophomore providing the production for Kentucky on offense. 147 of the Wildcats' 171 points scored this season coming from players who did not play last season. That's amazing. On the special teams side, Kentucky could have an issue here. Austin McGinnis just 10 for 15 on field goal kicks this season. And, of course, Colby De La Houssaye is one of the best in college football and nailed that 50-yarder against Florida to win it for the Tigers. LSU-Kentucky, I love the way the Wildcats are playing. They've got the vibe. They've got everything going for them right now in regards to psyche. They feel good about themselves. LSU expected so much out of this season, and the expectations from the community, from the Tiger faithful, and from the national fan base, from the national media, huge, and they're letting them down, feeling the heat of 5-2, and Kentucky coming in with little to lose. Although Kentucky's the team in the division race, and LSU's the team seemingly out of it with 2 losses in the SEC already. That said, if this was in Kentucky, if this game was in the Commonwealth, I would go with the Wildcats to pull off the upset. I do think that they cover here. I like LSU to win this one, let's say 27-23. And we'll take Kentucky plus the 9.5 points where this line stands right now. Need to hear from you right here on Mark Rogers TV concerning this SEC matchup of LSU and Kentucky.